Did Plato of Athens really believe that we live in an illusion, and if we could only pierce the veil of space and time, that we would discover a starry world of eternal patterns and forms beyond it all? If he did, how did he get to that realization? What philosophical influences and methods led him there? This is the first episode in which we're going to attempt a deeper dive into Plato's ideas, philosophical methodology, and theory of knowledge, with more to come. So last time around, we looked at Plato's life and works. This time we're going to try to look at his thought, and we'll focus especially on the early phases of his ideas before next time we'll get into the so-called middle and later periods of the Platonic dialogues. I'd like to try to start by approaching the question of how Plato asks questions, which is fairly fundamental for an author who writes only in the form of conversation and inquiry. That should lead us naturally into thinking together about the phases of his thought and how he developed as a thinker, at least according to one very common modern consensus. And that should set us up well to look at how he lays the foundations in the early and transitional phases of the dialogues for his basic theories about how we know anything, what's really real, and what we should value in ethics and in art. So to think first about Platonic questions, or how Plato asks questions, it might be nice to start from this very famous quotation from Alfred North Whitehead, which we've looked at a few times in the series. This is from Process and Reality. Whitehead writes, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. I don't mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writings. Rather, I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them, his personal endowments, his wide opportunities for experience at a great period of civilization, his inheritance of an intellectual tradition not yet stiffened by excessive systematization, have made his writings an inexhaustible mine of suggestion." That quote, I think, helpfully expands the famous remark that philosophy, especially in the European tradition, is like a series of footnotes to Plato, and shows that that's not about the answers that Plato gives, it's more about the way that he inquires. And from that perspective, certainly locally to the tradition we're talking about here, which coexists alongside extraordinary South Asian and East Asian traditions of philosophy and indigenous philosophies as well, it's certainly helpful to see Plato as laying the groundwork by the genres of questions he asks, and to think that when we look at later philosophy as responding somehow to him, it's in the sense that it's often trying to give answers to those questions. By the way, Whitehead's not the first to use this analogy of footnotes. Hölderlin said something very similar much earlier in the late 18th century, that the whole of modern philosophy is a mere footnote to Plato, because his ideas, like the sun, shine with a light that is both life-giving and blinding. This quote points more to Plato's famous allegory of the sun as like the good, or the form of the good, and in that sense it points to the more intuitive and inspired and positive philosophical reflections of Plato's middle period, where Whitehead's approach, focusing on Plato as a fount of inquiry and questioning, maybe points more to the early period that we'll be talking about today. In that connection, you might find it interesting to start looking at Plato's questioning from yet another quote. This one is a report of how ancient Greek skeptics thought about Plato's basic lessons for philosophy. "I know nothing and I teach nothing. I only wonder." And this view can be adapted quite carefully, as late ancient Platonists did, as non-skeptical, as actually really just saying that human knowledge is limited, but we should still aspire to know how things really are, and that wondering points us toward the value of dialogue for discovery. But it does reflect quotations we get very often from Plato's Socrates all through the dialogues. In the Apology, in the Symposium, in the Meno, in the Theaetetus, in the Gorgias, in the Charmides, even in the Theages, which is of doubtful authorship. All of these, really from every period in Plato's thought, converge around the value of inquiry and the idea that philosophy fundamentally begins in wonder. So all this is really just to say that it can be helpful to approach Plato in the first place by thinking about how he asks questions. And in that sense, we can also look at Plato's dialogues and how they functioned in his time. There was a burgeoning Mediterranean book trade, really getting off the ground in the 4th century BC, and Plato made use of it in brilliant and novel ways to draw minds from all over the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world to study in the academy that he founded, as you'll remember from our episode on Plato's life, around the 380s. But they also record throughout the pages of these dialogues a kind of fluid process of inquiry that lasted for decades across a long life. So it's natural that while Plato's questions are diverse, they also bear on a kind of central theme. The animating theme, I would argue, that is maybe most consistent from the early phases on. And that's the one that gives life and animation to this series as well. As Plato's Socrates says to Phaedrus in Phaedrus 229 to 230, "I'm still unable as the Delphic inscription enjoins me to know myself, and it seems to me ridiculous to look into anything else before I've understood that." Or again, in the first Alcibiades attributed to Plato in antiquity and by many modern scholars today, is it really such an easy thing to know ourselves? Was it a simpleton who inscribed these words on the temple wall at Delphi? Because if we could really know ourselves, then we might know how to cultivate ourselves. This idea of epimeleia of oneself is like gardening of one's own soul. I think this idea of the search for self-knowledge is a nice way to bring focus and concentration to this general spirit of Platonic inquiry, claiming that philosophy begins fundamentally in wonder and questioning, and that is Socrates' message. But self-knowledge necessitates all kinds of other knowledge too, and vice versa. In the Platonic and Socratic tradition, to understand ourselves, we have to understand a lot of other things, and to understand anything else, we have to understand ourselves. A nice way to get at this kind of interdependence is to go forward in time a little to the more systematic philosophies that follow Plato in the next 100 or 200 years. Think about the domains of philosophical questioning that develop and become sharper in their definition then, and then try to track that differentiation back into Plato as we start to look at some of the most fluid aspects of his early thought. For example, in one well-known report of the skeptic philosopher Pyrrho of Elis, his student Timon, and this is around the later 4th and 3rd century, so sometime after Plato's own time, Timon says, "According to Pyrrho, it's supremely necessary to investigate our own capacity for knowledge. For if we are so constituted that we know nothing, there's no need to continue inquiry into other things." And Timon says that anybody who wants to flourish must consider these 3 questions. Just to be clear, this is a report from Aristocles that's preserved in a much later author and is in Long and Sedley's collection of Hellenistic philosophy, section 1F. So these aren't quotes from Timon, and I'm attributing the idea that Aristocles offers that it's so important to investigate our own capacity for knowledge to Timon. But all that is really just to say these are much later systematic ideas reflecting this sort of early burgeoning phase of Greek philosophy. The first of the questions to look at is, how are things by nature, by physis? What are pragmata, or real things, actually like? The second is, what attitude should we adopt toward them? And the third is, what will be the outcome for people who maintain that kind of attitude? And very loosely, these can be defined as the 3 basic domains of philosophical inquiry that develop in the Hellenistic schools, like in the Stoa. How are things by nature will become what's sometimes called physics, what really exists. What attitude we should adopt becomes epistemology, or how we gain knowledge, and what the outcome will be becomes ethics, or how we should live in that case. So again, these are much, much later, more systematic ideas, but I'm going to try to draw on them to help organize some of this early Platonic material that we'll be looking at today. This kind of triad that I'll offer does come out in Aristotle, so in Plato's own student in the Topics, in this kind of early Pyrrhonism that we just cited, and maybe most vividly in the formal Hellenistic schools like the Stoa. So just to trace them out again, one is questions about what's really real. Questions about logic, how we can know anything, how we can gain knowledge and talk about reality. Stoics would call this logic, from the word logos. It's probably closer to what we would call epistemology or theory of knowledge, but there's also a kind of underlying or complementary element of philosophical methodology here. How do we talk about stuff? How does philosophy of language work? What kinds of heuristic inquiry are most likely to be helpful in philosophy and the sciences? And then on the basis of that, on the basis of views about how we can gain knowledge, we develop what the Stoics called physics, theories about what really exists based on that knowledge, which we might call ontology or metaphysics today, though it would classically in antiquity include physics as a science. And then on that basis, what we know about what's really real, we can inquire further into values, into, for example, what is really good and beautiful in ethics and art and human life. And in these later, more sort of systematic philosophical perspectives, these three are intertwining domains of philosophical discourse. Diogenes Laertius, for example, hundreds of years later, talking about the Stoics, emphasizes that philosophy, or at least philosophical discourse, can be seen like a garden, in which logic is the wall, that is, inquiry into how we know and understand stuff, holds the garden together. Physics is the land and trees that grows there, that is, our understanding of how things really are and who we really are, and ethics is the fruit of that knowledge. So if we take this idea of the kind of tripartition of philosophical discourse into logic, physics, and ethics in the ancient sense, and juxtapose it with this fundamentally Platonic curiosity about self-knowledge, how we can come to know ourselves, you can think about them as interdependent. If we really want to understand ourselves, we'll eventually find that we're drawn into inquiries about what the possibilities of human knowledge are, into inquiries about what's really real, what human nature is, and what kind of being a human being is, and into inquiries about what constitutes a good human life, and what constitutes beauty and value. And those in turn will shed light on the problem of self-knowledge. So those are some kind of tools to think with I wanted to introduce at the outset, this fundamental Platonic interest in self-knowledge and the way that it flows into what will later be systematized as three basic domains of philosophical inquiry. If you're curious about this in Stoicism, by the way, this more systematic later perspective, Katerina Ierodiaconu's article on the Stoic division of philosophy from 1993 is a classic. But for now, I just want to use this tripartition to structure the next few episodes as we start to look at Plato's thought. How can human beings gain knowledge? What's really real? And what should we value? And how should we live? As we look at those questions, we're going to divide up the next few episodes into phases based on Plato's philosophical development as it's usually hypothesized today. And you can look back at our episode on Plato's works for a bit more detail about this. Basically, we'll divide up the early Platonic dialogues, which are mostly focused on questioning and inquiry with an ethical flavor, and are often thought to be nearest to the work of the historical Socrates in Athens, from the so-called transitional dialogues, where we start to see more development of systematic commitments, though they're still open-ended, and there's clues toward what will later be called the theory of forms, patterns, or ideas. Then the middle dialogues, the sort of high classical period of innovative original Platonic proposals, especially the theory of forms. And finally, the late dialogues, as they're usually periodized. So dialogues that look back on that earlier tradition and apply probing inquiry and deeper systematic methods to test their assumptions. So, roughly in terms of time, these cover about 50 years or 5 decades of Plato's life, and which dialogues fall into which categories are still debated, but there's some general good consensus. So you'd find that most scholars would place the Apology or the Laches or the Euthyphro in the early period, the Meno in the Transitional period, the Phaedo or the Symposium or the Republic in the middle period, and maybe the Theaetetus and certainly the Timaeus, the Philebus, and the Laws in the later period. Also, worth mentioning something I noted in the episode on the works, where modern scholars tend to see these clusters as representing Plato's own intellectual and stylistic development over his life. Ancient commentators tended to think of Plato more as a coherent, systematic thinker through his whole life, who didn't really change his mind, so that the different clusters represent his own stylistic choices and the level of the reader. So a kind of reading order, like a curriculum, rather than a kind of order that sheds light on Plato's development. And even though these are very different and interestingly alternative assumptions about how to approach these stylistic clusters, which themselves are broadly agreed, they kind of point in the same direction, that there's 3 or 4 kind of clusters of styles and ideas that seem to hang together. Computer analysis has verified that, as Harold Tarrant's work, for example, shows. And it's really just a question of whether you like to think about them as reflecting Plato's development over time or as reflecting a way of approaching his ideas. And at some level, those can kind of come to the same thing. But the idea that these clusters represent Plato's development over time isn't only a modern one. It also comes up in antiquity and, in fact, very close to Plato's own life. So Plato's student Aristotle, writing in the Metaphysics in Book 1, Chapter 6, offers this miniature intellectual biography of Plato that's fascinating, and whether it's accurate has been much debated, but it gives us a nice sort of way in to give some color to this bare division of early, maybe transitional, middle, and late thought. So Aristotle writes, having in his youth first become familiar with Cratylus and with the Heraclitean doctrines, that takes us back to the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. You might remember our episode on this Heraclitean view, at least as it's often ascribed to him, that sensible things are in a constant state of flux and you can't know about them. So Aristotle says Plato was very sympathetic to that kind of critique of sensation that he took from a Heraclitean tradition that flowed from Cratylus, who was teaching this view in Athens in Plato's youth. So that's kind of step 1 according to Aristotle. Then we know that Plato comes into contact with Socrates and is much influenced by Socrates, and Aristotle says Socrates was busying himself about ethical matters and neglecting the world of nature as a whole, so he's not doing a lot of natural philosophy, that is inquiry into how things are, or physics in that later Stoic sense, but he's seeking the universal in these ethical matters and fixing thought for the first time on definitions. This description of Socrates' thoughts, you can imagine this Plato, who's kind of sympathetic to this Cratylus and Heraclitus view, encountering Socrates and getting really invested in this Socratic interest in ethics, definitions, and the universal. That kind of corresponds to the early dialogues quite well. Then, Aristotle goes on, Plato accepted this teaching, but held that the problem applied not to any sensible thing, but to entities of another kind, for this reason, that the common definition could not be a definition of any sensible thing, as they were always changing. So this starts to look like what we call the transitional and middle dialogues, where Plato's kind of combining these 2 early ideas. He's got the Socratic interest in what can be discovered in the realm of ethics by the search for definitions, but he's worrying that those kinds of definitions won't jive very well with a Heraclitean world of constant sensory flux, where everything is as it seems to different people, maybe. That's a more Protagorean view that Plato will later combine with Heraclitus in the dialogue called the Theaetetus. So you can see this kind of set of concerns starting to intertwine, the Socratic ethical quest for universals and this Heraclitean metaphysics. then we get a potential solution. Things of this other sort, that Socratic kind of search for definitions can stably apply to, Plato called ideas. This is from the word eidos, or ideia in Greek, which is cognate with our word video in English, by the way. It can mean something like a pattern that shows up, often something you see, but for Plato especially, not with your eyes. It's more to do with pattern recognition, usually translated forms, and in the next episode we're going to talk lots more about these. But basically, Aristotle says, the things that really do show up to Socratic inquiry as stable targets for definition, so to speak, well, these things that can be defined, Plato called ideas. Not concepts, by the way. They're not just entities in the mind, they're mind-independent realities, fundamental constant patterns. Again, we'll talk more about these next time. But then where does that leave the stuff we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell, sensible things? Well, according to Aristotle, Plato said, well, that's quite separate from the patterns that we really grasp with this Socratic method, with philosophy, basically. What we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell is actually kind of imitating this world of constant patterns. Because the multitude of things that have the same name as the form or idea exist by participation in it. So, for example, if something shows up as appearing red to us, we recognize the pattern of redness in it and we name it red, not because that flag or that picture is redness in itself, but because it gets the name red from participating in the pattern that we recognized of redness. And as we'll talk about this next time, this applies for Plato across the realm of mathematics, which is why he sponsors mathematical research in such important ways in the academy, in the sciences, in ethics, in the arts, and right across the board. So this development of this idea, which we're just mentioning here and we'll get into more next time, according to Aristotle, is actually a kind of Pythagorean one. He goes on to say the name participation is new with Plato, but he's really getting this idea from the Pythagoreans. You can see our episode on Pythagoras, or at least traditions about Pythagoras, for more about them. But according to Aristotle, it's no wonder that Plato's so mathematical about this notion of participation in ideas or forms, because the Pythagoreans said roughly the same thing, that the things we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell exist by imitation of number. So it's a sort of adaptation of this Pythagorean idea, according to Aristotle. In addition, many scholars, including seemingly Plato himself in some late dialogues, gestures toward the thought of another pre-Socratic, Parmenides, who we've also talked about in the series, for the sort of constancy and stability of the ideas or forms apart from the Heraclitean flux. So at this point, you've got a mix of philosophical influences in play, and you can kind of see how Plato's working on uniting them. According to this story from Aristotle, the young Plato is intrigued by this Heraclitean idea that everything we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell is in flux, both maybe in the sense that it's always changing and in the sense that it's kind of relative to the observer. Then he encounters Socrates, and he's deeply invested in and moved by Socrates' project of seeking stable ethical definitions we can live by, but that metaphysical concern still motivates him, and he comes to think that this kind of Socratic method can't get at the sensory things that Heraclitus was supposedly talking about, because they're always on the move, so you can't define them. And then maybe drawing on the influence of Parmenides and his faith in the capacity of the mind to grasp something constant, and the Pythagoreans and their interest in stable mathematics. He says, aha, well, philosophical method can get us to understand these kinds of Socratic patterns that are stable and constant and not just relative to the observer. But look, it's not just about ethics. That's true, but it's also about everything. Aesthetics, mathematics, science, we're always seeking pattern recognition, if you like, stable, constant, unchanging patterns everywhere we look. And so it's kind of a compelling story about how Plato's ideas might have developed. And it leaves us with one stage, which there's kind of a gesture toward in this comment by Aristotle too. What the participation or imitation of forms could be, that is, Plato's students, left an open question. And that kind of points to the sort of inquiring and testing spirit of later Platonic dialogues like the Sophist and the Parmenides, where Plato's much more invested in trying to work out the details of the relationship between the constant and sensory worlds. So just thinking about the structure of Plato's thought again and this notion of development over time, if you like to put this story from Aristotle together with the modern periodization, it's not a perfect fit, and I'm making it look a little too schematic here for what I think most people would support, but at least loosely it's a nice way in to think about how Plato was motivated and how he was putting these considerations together. So with that in the background, we're going to talk now about just the early and transitional phases of Plato's thought and writing. In terms of the three domains of philosophical discourse that we raised from the much later thought, from the Stoics, and to some degree, perhaps, from Pyrrho of Elis, according to Timon, we can think about what the earliest dialogues and some of the transitional dialogues tell us about the Socratic inquiry into moral definitions, that is, the field of how we can know anything. What they tell us about reality, very little, as we'll see. What they tell us about value, that is, what ethical ideas go at least unrefuted in the early dialogues, and a central commitment that runs right through them all, which is this understanding of oneself, of what one really values as the soul or psyche. So let's look first at some of the early dialogues. I'm also going to take some time here to look at some of the transitional dialogues. So there's some differences between them, especially in the sense that the transitional dialogues seem to lay groundwork for more positive Platonic ideas later, but for the level of detail we'll get into here, we can mostly look at them together. In the early dialogues, we can look at this sort of tripartition and at least use it as a loose heuristic guide to think about what ideas Socrates brings up. And if you're interested in this phase, there's lots written you can get into. One recent example is Hugh Benson's article, Euthyphro, Apology, and Crito, on the examined and virtuous life in Fine's new edition of the Oxford Handbook of Plato. But generally, I think just at a high level, we'll try to look at knowledge first and think about Socratic method. So how do we really get to know anything? The classic Socratic practice, as we've talked about before in our series, is the elenchus, or dialogue that cross-examines someone who is usually on the verge of taking some important moral action and tries to draw out of them definitions of the moral terms in which they justify their actions. So in these early conversations, Plato's usually representing Socrates in a conversation with very well-known partners, conversation partners in 5th century Athens. And dramatically, the dialogues usually begin with the interlocutor invoking some kind of value term, some virtue term, to justify something they're up to at that point. For example, I'm doing this because it's the just thing to do, or it's the pious thing to do, or it's the brave or temperate or wise thing to do. In one example that's often raised, Euthyphro is a character who Socrates runs into at an important moment when he's about to go prosecute his father for murder. And it's a sort of tricky case under Athenian law. Socrates wonders why he's doing it, and Euthyphro says, well, I'm doing it because it's the pious thing to do, which leads Socrates to say, can you define for me what piety is? Because clearly you know you're taking a big decision based on that knowledge, and I'm very curious. I long for wisdom. I want to understand. So that's a nice example of the kind of thing that Socrates is regularly doing, pressing an interlocutor to provide a definition of the virtue that they appeal to explain what they're doing, saying that he, Socrates, has no idea how to define the term himself, and that if anybody did have that ability, it would be diagnostic of their wisdom in the sense of a kind of knowledge of human values and virtue that he seeks, that he's explored all of Athens trying to find, because he himself claims to know nothing at all. So many of these early dialogues stage these kinds of conversations where this sort of definition is sought. And as we've talked about before, at least in a loose and sort of impressionistic way, this is quite accessible. I mean, it makes sense that many of us live, or at least think we live, according to values at some level that Socrates might recognize as virtues. We want to live fairly or sustainably or wisely or bravely. But we, like Socrates' contemporaries, maybe can relate to the idea that we don't collectively give a huge amount of time to reflecting on what they really mean to us. So it's sort of intuitive to some degree, maybe, to follow Socrates in thinking that if we could really invest in that understanding, maybe we would individually and collectively be able to lead more coherent and happy lives. So the output of this kind of practice would be definitions of these virtue terms. Socrates, since he doesn't claim to really know anything about this project, never gives us a kind of explicit definition of definitions. He never really says exactly what he's looking for. It's more like there's a game being played according to intuitive rules, and those rules will actually be formalized later in Plato's Academy, and especially by Aristotle, as really formal logic as we come to know it, especially term logic. But even though there isn't an explicit set of definitions of definitions, there are some assumptions that a lot of scholars agree are consistent. First of all, definitions in answer to Socrates' questions are expected to be general or universal. They should help us to recognize all the instances. And that's one reason why Socrates famously seems to reject examples as valid answers. So when Euthyphro says, "Oh, what is piety? That's what I'm doing right now, prosecuting my father," Socrates says, well, that might be true, but it's not a definition because it doesn't apply to every possible case. It's too narrow. So even at this very early stage, Socrates introduces the term eidos, which is later going to be translated as form, as in Plato's theory of forms, and can also be, as I did a few minutes ago, translated as pattern or type or something like that, a kind of something that shows up to us. And using pattern as a translation is maybe helpful because it points to this expectation that the pattern is going to belong to all such cases. Another nice example of this is the laches, which is a dialogue not inquiring into piety, but a different virtue, namely courage. So when one of the characters says, "Socrates, maybe courage is standing your ground in battle," Socrates says it's a nice example, but look, there's counterexamples. What about archers who fight bravely in retreat? So that counterexample shows that this particular answer is too specific. There's some other requirements too. So in addition to being general, the definition shouldn't be circular. It shouldn't assume what's going to be defined. It also should not be self-contradictory, which is important. In fact, it's really important to Socrates that the definition will reveal the coherence of all the interlocutors' beliefs with one another and the coherence of their beliefs with their actions. So consistency and coherence is an important constraint too. But on top of those so far, that is, the definition should be general or universal, it should not be circular, and it should be consistent. Maybe the most important of all, at least emotionally or practically, is that the response should be sincere, the so-called sincerity requirement. So this comes up in a number of early and transitional dialogues in the Gorgias, for example, at 495 and 500, in the Protagoras around 331, and in many other places, that what Socrates is looking for is not a clever answer or not an answer that will win. He's looking for a genuine answer about what the interlocutor really believes. And he says over and over again, especially in transitional dialogues where the method is more explicitly reflected on, that this is the heart of it. I mean, you're not going to get any closer to the truth in a Socratic conversation until you answer from the heart and say what you really believe. The outcome of these inquiries, though, is not generally positive. They yield in the early dialogues consistently a state called aporia, which literally means no flow, uncertainty, or lack of understanding. No interlocutor ever succeeds in answering Socrates' request. They give some examples that don't really work because there are counterexamples, and they give a definition that often doesn't work because the definition fails in some other way, maybe it's self-contradictory, but more importantly, the definition eventually shows a contradiction exists among the beliefs of the interlocutor themselves. They're committed to multiple different things that can't be true at the same time. So they're sort of sent back to the drawing board, back to square one, to reflect on what they really believe and what's most important to them. Which of their contradictory beliefs, usually moral beliefs, aesthetic beliefs, are they going to drop to be consistent in their beliefs and their actions? In some dialogues, most famously in the Meno around 80, this recognition of aporia, this kind of getting stuck, is compared to being numbed by a stingray. That Socrates sort of causes this moral numbness where we realize that we don't know what we thought we knew, and we were so sure habitually we could act by. Socrates himself, of course, never gives a positive definition in these dialogues, but he also underscores the value of intellectual humility and encourages the interlocutor not to give up, but to start again and to do what he does, to keep looking, to act from confidence that they may not know now, but they might. Socrates seems to think, if he thinks anything positive about this at this stage, that this is a good thing to pause on our way, so to speak, to do something of great moral import and realize that we don't really understand the values we're acting by, and to take some time to reflect on them and question them. There are some later dialogues that raise puzzles about whether this sort of moral pause is actually a good thing for individuals and for a community. There's some allusion to this problem in the first book of the Republic, for example, a middle dialogue, and in the Cleitophon, whose authorship has been disputed, and maybe most famously in the modern scholarship, Peter Geach's article on Plato's Euthyphro in The Monist in 1966 emphasizes this problem. If you're just sort of morally numbing everybody you talk to realize that the values ingrained in them by habituation in their society are questionable, are you really doing anything good? But of course, this goes with some of the other factors we've talked about in Socratic ethics before, in our episodes on Socrates and his thought, that he thinks, if he does again think anything positive about this, that we need a sort of moral humility to stop doing the harmful collective things that we're doing. You might say, in a more contemporary sense, that many of our decisions are guided by implicit biases that we don't understand, by stereotypes and socialization that at least should be questioned before we act blindly according to it. But also, most importantly, if you come back to that theme of self-knowledge, there's this Socratic view that we have to understand what we truly value if we're going to lead a consistent life that is genuinely going to be a happy life. In some of our other episodes, we've talked about passages where Socrates underscores and kind of summarizes his own pattern of inquiry. In Apology 29-30, for example, where he says, Philosophia, or the love of wisdom, is for him exhortation, a reorganization of values toward wisdom, truth, and the health of one's psyche, the practice of questioning, examining, and testing. We looked at this in episode 7.3 in more detail. And there's other characters who summarize this kind of process elsewhere. In the Laches, which we talked about, the dialogue about courage, a character says that anybody who tries to talk to Socrates about anything will be led on to answer questions about themselves, how they live, and go into detail about their values. And for Socrates, according to Plato, getting to that sort of examination means paying attention to this kind of faculty or constraint that he calls the logos. The word we've also talked about a bit before. It can mean reason or formula. It can also mean word. And in some ways it can mean meaning or almost conscience. Lots and lots of different ways we can construe it. But loosely, to talk things through, to examine them, to reason about them, and to try to find this kind of coherence in how we live is a fundamentally Socratic project. The idea that only a life that is examined in this way, where we're in dialogue with others and ourselves about what we value, where we seek coherence between what we value and what we do, only that kind of life leads to human flourishing. So all of that tells us a bit about knowledge in this early phase. What about what's really real, or in that kind of later Stoic tripartition, what will be called physics? So because Socrates' method at this early stage is so tentative and questioning. We have very little evidence to go on for positive views about anything. Really, all we can talk about is what's put forward and left unrefuted in Socratic conversations. But there are lots of theories about what might be the implicit metaphysical commitments at this stage. Some scholars have argued that Socrates is assuming what Plato will later demonstrate, that virtues, for example, are real discoverable entities. Other scholars argue that Socrates really makes almost no metaphysical assumptions and is just focused on a methodology that gets to some kind of useful place. And others take a kind of middle ground where it looks like space is opened up in the early and transitional dialogues, certainly in the transitional dialogues, for Plato's later metaphysical views, but without any real explicit commitments. And something like that certainly seems true in the transitional period, but could be much debated in the early period. But in short, there's not a lot we can say here other than that there are spaces left open that middle period Plato will fill in with the famous and celebrated theory of ideas, or theory of forms, which we'll talk about next time. So that takes us to our third area of inquiry, which is value or ethics. And there is a lot that's introduced in these early dialogues and at least left unrefuted in this general domain. So, for example, you can look at the first sections of the Stanford Encyclopedia article on Plato's ethics for a summary, but I'll try to bring out here what seems most important to me. One of the most common and consistent findings in Socrates' conversations that may not be proven, but is left unchallenged and unrefuted in the end, is that the deepest good for a human being is not pleasure or wealth or fame, but arete, which can be translated as virtue or excellence or human goodness. And moreover, that while there are many different flavors of arete, you could be courageous or just or wise or temperate or pious or really excellent in many other ways at humaning, they all come down to one thing. In some sense, they're either reducible to or actually just are a kind of wisdom, one that guides us in how to use all our excellences beneficially. So for example, we might be really good at math, that could be a kind of arete, but we could use that for good or ill. Wisdom is the kind of fundamental or root or keystone arete because it teaches us how to use all those excellences well or wisely. This kind of idea is very consistent throughout all the early dialogues and is never really seriously challenged. So we could take it as a sort of almost positive ethical view. Another one that comes up or is implicit fairly often and is explicit in some places, like in Protagoras 358c, is that no one does on purpose what appears wrong to them. This is a really interesting idea that Socrates thinks we are always motivated to act according to what seems good to us. We might be wrong about what's good, but whatever it is, at that moment when we choose to do it, we're doing what seems good. And there's a number of interesting kind of implications of this, one of which we'll talk about in a minute, that if we're doing something wrong, we really deserve education rather than punishment, which may be less effective. But this sort of motivational view also leads to the idea that no one ever acts against their own judgments of what's good. It might seem like I do. It might seem like I have a judgment that drinking a 7th cup of coffee wouldn't be very good for me today. But nonetheless, I have a kind of desire or appetite for the experience or the pleasure of the cup that leads me to contravene that judgment. For Socrates, it's not like that. I have this deeper judgment that coffee's really good, and that overcomes the first judgment. So this is sometimes called the denial of acrasia, the denial that we ever really suffer from weakness of the will, because our will always on this view tends to what seems good to us, which is why philosophy is so important, because philosophy can excavate and analyze our beliefs about what's really good, including these deeply hidden beliefs that actually motivate our actions. So philosophy can change our lives because of this view. That connects with what's sometimes called Socratic intellectualism, that most or all human actions are motivated by something judgment-like, whether it's explicit or deeply implicit, not just by other motivations that are not open to reasoning and cannot be affected by philosophy. So my judgment that coffee is really so fundamentally and deeply good can be affected by philosophy, unlike just a non-reasoning, grasping need for coffee. In any case, this is important again practically because Plato has Socrates say frequently that wrongdoers need not punishment but education, because education is really philosophy. It can uproot beliefs that are implicit in our biased or harmful behavior. There's some other surprising so-called Socratic paradoxes in ethics in the early dialogues. One is that it's better to suffer harm unjustly than to do it unjustly. And there's much more depth given to this later in the middle dialogues, but in the transitional phase, for example, in the Gorgias, it's introduced with a kind of assumption that one causes oneself psychological harm when one does injustice. And that seems like such a shocking and surprising paradox, but in the middle dialogues, especially in Republic Book 4, and in a few other places, Plato will try to defend it. The idea that ultimately doing injustice in a motivational sense tears us apart from the inside so badly and causing such harm over the long term to our psychology and our coherence, that kind of coherence of value and action that Socrates safeguards, that it's really the only kind of serious harm we can suffer, this kind of harm to the coherence of the psyche. So lots of big surprises there and big ideas that we'll talk about more next time, but they're implicitly traced out here. Socrates often emphasizes in these dialogues the importance of this kind of inquiry into how we should live, and this notion that our way of life should be just, and that we should not do injustice, extends not only to individuals, but also to collectives. So we see this as well, for example, in the view Socrates expresses in the Crito 50a, that you should not do unjust harm to the conventions or laws of your community, even where they err. You should do everything you can to change them justly, but if you feel that what you're doing is wrong by your own conscience, it's not worth it, according to Socrates there. So it should be emphasized that doesn't mean you shouldn't engage in activism. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try to change your laws in the society you live in. You should. Socrates exemplifies that, at least in these early dialogues. He's going around working as hard as he can to change norms, customs, and beliefs. However, if what you have to do as a means to accomplish that end ultimately works against your own norms of justice, forces you into a situation where you're acting against your own genuine conscience, then again, from the Socratic point of view, it's not morally worth it. All of this falls into the broader kind of thematization of Greek philosophy as a way of life. The idea that when an ancient Greek and Roman person thought they were identifying as a philosopher in the Socratic spirit, according to scholars like Pierre Hadot, they weren't just committing to a way of thinking thoughts, but also to a way of living. At one point in the first book of the Republic, which is probably mostly a later or middle dialogue rather, but has kind of early Socratic resonances, Socrates says the question here isn't about anything ordinary, but about how we should live, our tropos of life. And this is a nice way to thematize again what Socrates is up to in the sense of seeking philosophical value. Because again, according to this kind of Socratic ethic, everything that we do is grounded in our beliefs about what seems good. And because philosophy can change those beliefs, philosophy can become profoundly effective as the steersperson of a life alongside the pursuit of truth, as John Cooper puts it in his book, Pursuits of Wisdom. And that kind of philosophy isn't something we do by ourselves just in an isolated way, reflecting on our own minds and thoughts. It's a kind of ongoing process of dialogue, ideally with others, who all, again, answer sincerely from their heart about what they really believe. And in this sense, conversation, intersubjectivity, diversity of opinion is really important, although it's also worth mentioning that, if necessary, at least in a much later biographical perspective that I quite enjoy, this kind of conversation can be done on the inside. So there's this story that Socrates couldn't always find someone to talk to and ask questions of, and the later Stoic Epictetus says that he handled that by keeping a diary, which I think is a lovely story. This is from Discourses 2:1-32. We're always taught that Socrates didn't write anything down except maybe some poetry later in life in prison, versifying Aesop's fables. But according to this quite different tradition, didn't Socrates write? Yes! Who wrote as much as he did? But how did he go about it? Since he couldn't always have someone at his side to subject his beliefs to examination, elenchus, or be cross-examined in turn, he used to subject himself to examination and test himself out, and was always trying out the practical application of some particular preconception, using some later Hellenistic technical vocabulary here from the Epicurean Garden and the Stoa. That's the kind of thing that a philosopher writes. So wherever that tradition comes from, it's just, I think, a lovely image of Socrates keeping this journal of self-reflection, even if it may not be historically accurate. One last thing to emphasize about the theory of value in Socrates, which sort of verges into a theory about what's real. All the Socratics suggest that Socrates was most deeply invested in understanding, again through self-knowledge, who or what we really are, so that we can care for and cultivate ourselves in this kind of investigation into our beliefs and values. Later Platonists will put it like this: if we could only learn who we are, we could learn what is good for us. And this brings us around to a really important word in Plato, especially later, but already in the early dialogues, which is psyche in the reconstructed Erasmian pronunciation, or psyche in modern Greek, or psyche in English, usually translated as soul, the root of our words like psychology, the logos of the psyche. The psyche, in a way, is the sort of locus, very loosely, of lived experience and agency. And in one interpretation of Socrates' view in these early dialogues, the psyche is fundamentally unified. It's not really something with motivational plurality that pulls in a lot of different directions and competes with itself, which is a view we'll find in maybe later Plato and maybe Aristotle. But it's this sort of fundamental locus of experience and agency. We have impressions, and we choose how to respond according to our values and beliefs. And that's why self-knowledge and philosophy are so important, to learn what we really believe. This word psyche, by the way, literally means breath in Greek. It goes all the way back to Homer and very early Greek, where it has to do with understanding what is present in a living being but absent in an inanimate being. It's very much like the word anima in Latin, where we get words like animal, and in the same way, psychos is the usual ancient Greek word for a living being, one that is endowed with psyche. Lots of words and lots of languages that connect breath and life in this way. But by the 5th and 4th centuries, by Plato's time, it has this more sort of specific coloring. It has to do with lived experience, thought, and feeling, and again, this sort of locus of agency and experience. And the reason I raise this here is that there are ethical implications of locating selfhood in the psyche, or psyche. If it turned out that we were only our bodies, our wise choices would focus on preserving our bodies, come what may. And if we were only our reputation or our honor, our wise choices would preserve our social standing. But, according to Socrates, at least in the views that are not refuted in a net of early and transitional dialogues, it's probably best to see ourselves as psyche, that is, as this kind of locus of experience and agency. So sometimes it's right for us to do what's unpleasant or unpopular, because epimeleia of ourselves, caring for the self, is to care for the integrity and unity of the psyche, to hold together all of our beliefs in coherence. That's why harmony is so important, and not doing injustice is so important, because it ultimately tears us apart motivationally. And it's also at least implicit in many of the early dialogues that psyche is something that may be immortal. Socrates doesn't commit to it with the same sort of precision, discipline, and argument that he does in some later dialogues, but he implies it. He says, to fear death is just another form of that old vice, to think one knows what one doesn't know, and then more directly later, death is no evil. Or again, in the Phaedo, which is either a late transitional or middle dialogue, I can't persuade Crito that I am this Socrates here who is talking to you now and marshalling all the arguments. He thinks that I am that dead body that he'll presently see, but really I am this living locus of this locus of lived experience and agency and choice. So all that is to say, because Socrates is at least developing this commitment that Plato will explore in much more depth later, that we should think of ourselves as our psyche and make choices to bring unity and motivational coherence and harmony to our experiences and our choices, because that's who we really are, and that is forever. This is maybe the closest to a single sort of positive metaphysical commitment we see in these early dialogues. And it's also well connected with the theme of a way of life, the life that conserves the harmony and the well-being of the psyche, which is what Socrates says in the Apology as well. So there's some general themes about knowledge, reality, and value in the early dialogues, and that should set us in good stead to talk more a little bit later about the middle dialogues. If you're interested in these general themes, some other books to think about: The Philosophy of Socrates by Brickhouse and Smith is a classic, focusing in part on this phase. Deborah Nail's The People of Plato will introduce the characters, the cast of characters you encounter. Martha Nussbaum's classic The Fragility of Goodness explores in the broader light of Greek poetry and tragedy what's distinctive about Plato's Socrates. Cooper's Pursuits of Wisdom looks at the influence of this Socratic tradition of philosophy as a way of life throughout later philosophical schools, like some of the more systematic schools we brought back into this view. Taylor's very short introduction to Socrates is a great general text, and Julia Annis's Platonic Ethics, Old and New, will set these Socratic commitments into the broader story of Plato's intellectual development. Next time, we'll look in more detail at the middle phases of Plato's thought and the development of the mature theory of forms, or patterns, or ideas.
Prosoligones titozen, totelos o chronos ape.